Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, dear friends, good morning and assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Symposium on Countering Violent Extremism. This symposium today is organized by the Islamic Renaissance Front in collaboration with the Penang Institute. So on behalf of both organizations, IRF and the Penang Institute, I would like to welcome you all today. And to be honest, we are a little bit surprised because much larger number of participants registered for this event. Unfortunately, they haven't showed up, so we don't know exactly why, whether it's a weather factor or something else. Anyhow, we will still, I'm sure, enjoy and benefit from this very important event. Let me first introduce you to our program today. As you have been probably following the events internationally and particularly in the Middle East, there has been during recent years a lot of violent activities. Some newly emerging so-called states, Islamic, call them Islamic states. There is a lot of violence, extremism. There is a lot of intra-Muslim conflict. We are all appalled by the events, and we are very concerned, just as I guess everyone is internationally. So these events, these symposiums are very helpful for us to understand the reasons behind of these events, these extremist activities, and unfortunately, a lot of the time they are linked to Islam, as Islam has been abused and misused and misinterpreted and reduced to a very narrow interpretation to justify certain political agendas of certain groups. So it is very important for organizations like IRF to actually be at the forefront in our societies to try and explain these events and give some sort of meaning and understanding and try to find ways as to how we best can counter these violent extremist activities. So today we brought our very distinguished prominent speakers, international speakers, academics, whom I will later introduce. But before that, let me invite our introductory speaker, who will address you first, and then we will have a video presentation. After the video presentation, we will introduce our other distinguished guest speakers, and then we will continue with our program. I am told by Chairman Dr. Farouk that the last event, which I haven't attended, was really quite significant. There was more than 100 people in attendance. Unfortunately, this time is a little bit different, but nevertheless, I am pretty sure that we will benefit from this symposium. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me invite His Excellency Yang Berhurmat Zair El-Khir Johari, Executive Director of the Penang Institute, to address you, and then we will have a video presentation. So, Mr. Johari, let me welcome him to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Osman, and distinguished panel this morning, Dr. Farouk, our moderator, our special guests from the US and also from Singapore, Professor Said Farid and Professor Ibrahim Musa. On behalf of the Penang Institute, I'd like to wish all of you Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, and welcome, of course, to our symposium today. Another joint effort by IRF and Penang Institute. Actually, it's a bit of a shame because the last round was a very big crowd and very, very good, I thought, robust sort of engagement. But hopefully, as you say, there'll be more filtering in this morning. So, I think the topic today is quite important, given the circumstances today. Symposium on countering violent extremism. Etymologically, Islam, as most of you know, is derived from the Arabic root word that means peace. Although, unfortunately, as many, such as Farid Zakaria, political commentator on CNN, pointed out, Islam today is more often than not associated with violence and militancy. And citing statistics by the US State Department, Farid Zakaria actually asserts that 7 out of the top 10 groups that perpetrated terrorist attacks in 2013, last year, were Muslim groups. And most of these attacks also took place in Muslim-majority countries. So indeed, what is generally perceived in the modern day as terrorism usually carries an Islamic connotation. And when one thinks of terrorist organizations, automatically names such as Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, Taliban, and closer to home, Jama'ah Islamiyah come to mind. And on top of that, it is usually also in Muslim countries or Muslim majority countries and societies where we hear of honor killings, stoning of adulterous women, death for apostasy, and other human rights abuses usually carried out in the name of God. In this context, it is not unreasonable to suggest that the Muslim world is faced with the great challenge of religious extremism. In fact, some have even suggested further that Islam is innately violent, or as Samuel Huntington puts it, simply antithetical to Western notions of democratic civilization. However, this primordial worldview is too simplistic, ignores the heterogeneity of the different traditions in Islam, as well as the fact that for most part of world history, Christendom or Christianity has actually been far more violent and barbaric, especially with regards to the treatment of minorities. You think of the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, the big witch hunts. But even more importantly, it also glosses over the fact that the evolution of religion, as with any other kind of sociological ideology, is as much, if not more defined and shaped by political interests than it is by actually divine doctrine. According to the Pew Research Center, this was a report last year, I believe, 19 of the 24 most religiously restricted countries in the world are Muslim majority countries. And unfortunately, Malaysia is one of them. We share the honor of being ranked together with Egypt, Syria, Afghanistan, Sudan, and Iraq, where government laws, policies, and actions impose very high restrictions on religious beliefs and practices. However, before one hastily concludes that Islam is inherently conservative and suppressive, we should bear in mind that this same list also includes China, Vietnam, Myanmar, Russia, and Eritrea, none of which are Muslim majority countries, but all of which share a glaring lack of democratic space and some form of authoritarian style governance. Therefore, perhaps a more useful hypothesis is that the stronger the grasp of authoritarianism in a country, the more rigid and conservative the experience of religion becomes, precisely because the state usually will attempt to capture, define, and control religion. And this is true for any dominant ideology, whether religion or not, because an authoritarian power will not allow any ideological competition. Hence, the encroachment and usurpation of Islam as a convenient tool for the dual purpose of suppressing democratic space and legitimizing authoritarian hegemony. So at this point, one may put forward the suggestion that perhaps there is something about Islam that makes Muslim societies susceptible to totalitarianism. However, as I posited earlier, any dominant ideology can and will be captured by an undemocratic regime. You can substitute Islam with ethno-nationalism, and we can imagine Nazi Germany. We can substitute Islam with extreme agrarian socialism, and we can imagine Pol Pot's Cambodia. So in other words, it is less to do with ideology than it is to do with politics and a distribution of power. In fact, Islam can indeed be a potent ideological tool in the hands of authoritarian regimes, but on the other hand, it can also be an enabler of freedom and enlightenment. We can think of the Islah movement in Egypt in the 19th and early 20th century that was pushed by progressive thinkers such as Jamaluddin al-Afghani, Muhammad Abduh, and Rashid Rida. And going back further, there's a rich history of Islamic advancement, particularly during the height of the golden Islamic age, from the 9th to the 13th century, when Muslim scholars led the world in the field of mathematics, physics, medicine, astronomy. And so it is apparent that Islam as an ideology can either be abused for hegemonic oppression or used to enable freedom and enlightenment. And these are two vastly different social realities. So the question is, what determines the path? I would suggest that it depends very much in the dynamics that exist within the religious experience in a given country. Borrowing a bit from Shamsul A.B., a social reality can be authority defined, that is to say determined by those in a dominant power structure, or everyday defined, which reflects the experience of people in the course of everyday life. And these two social realities are not mutually exclusive. Actually, they exist in tandem, although they are often at conflict with one another. And so where democratic space is available, a more organic, everyday defined kind of Islam would evolve and hold dominance. In this case, Islam would be more peaceful and more tolerant. And it would also enable civilizational advancement. The problem occurs when the state decides to exert increasing control. So, for example, we look at the recent incidences in Malaysia. For example, the I Want to Touch a Dog campaign that was held in Central Park in Selangor, PJ. And when it was reported that some Muslim participants in the event had been pictured touching or petting dogs, the National Fatwa Council gathered and decided that touching dogs is against the state-defined doctrine of Islam. This ruling, not only ignores the myriad of scholarly views on the matter by many other schools of thought, but it's also incongruous with long-established practices of Muslims the world over. Clearly, this is an attempt to impose authority-defined values onto society. And the same applies in the case of the confiscation of Malay Bibles, raids on churches that conduct services in Malay, as well as the banning of the use of the kalimah Allah by non-Muslims. Actually, as we all know, for decades, for many, many years, churches, especially in East Malaysia, especially but not exclusively in East Malaysia, have been using Malay, our national language, to preach. The Malay Bible has been used, and everyone has shared the name Allah. And this has never been an issue to society until today, when the state suddenly decided that it would endanger the faith of Malay Muslims in the country. And it is this same politically motivated decision-making that also prodded the state to ban the Malay translation of Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species and Karen Armstrong's Islam, A Short History, on the predication that such books constitute a danger to public harmony. Yet the state fails to explain why they are a threat only in the national language, whereas their English versions are freely available. So obviously there is an underlying political agenda. Increasingly, the state is attempting to impose an authority-defined version of how Islam should be practiced, which, as the examples I mentioned illustrate, is usually provocative, illogical, and contradictory to the everyday defined societal norms. So for the most part, they are self-serving and designed to legitimize the power of the authorities. So in contrast to the parochial nature of Islam that is propagated by those in power, the everyday defined Islamic experience in this region has always been accommodative, progressive, and most importantly, peaceful. Even in the case of female leadership, this notion was rejected by certain quarters during the recent leadership crisis in Selangor. When it was the prospect of a female chief minister came up, suddenly there were certain leaders who rejected or refused to accept the fact that we could have female leaders. And this actually is completely contrarian to culture in this region, because historical experiences have shown that, female leadership is not an innovation in the Malay world. We have had female leaders in Kelantan, in Patani, Aceh, Solor, in Jambi. So when the state tries to define this sort of try to define the narrative of religion, in most cases, the state or any kind of religious authorities, it's also incongruent with what actually goes on in society. And it's the same with the obsession over the Malay translations of the Bible, which I mentioned. I mean, today we have extremists who are publicly threatening to burn Bibles, an act that the government actually tries to justify as an attempt to protect the sanctity of Islam. Again, this is entirely at odds with the fact that Malay Bibles have been around since 1628, when the first was produced by the Dutch. Nearly 4 centuries on, and this was produced in Indonesia in 1628, and nearly 400 years later, the Malaysian religious authorities may be shocked to learn that Indonesia has not only not become a Christian country, it houses the largest number of Muslims in the world. So it is clear from the history and experience of this region that the ideas and ideals of Islam that are rooted in equality, justice, social progress can and will flourish organically when it is not constrained by artificial controls imposed by the state for political ends. But on the other hand, extremism arises when common sense and freedom is suppressed. So the struggle against extremism must therefore begin with the demand for more democratic space, politically, socially, even economically. It is only when society is empowered that the doctrine of the authorities and their ideological monopoly on people's ideology can be broken. So one thing for certain, the state would not simply give up its stranglehold currently on Islam. Therefore, it is up to us to continually to push the boundaries of discourse and debate, that we may enlighten ourselves. So efforts such as what the IRF is trying to do, continually pushing the boundaries, continually talking and bringing up these issues for discourse, is an effort that is really needed and that the Penang Institute supports and will continue to support. This is a struggle that is necessary if we do not wish to slide down the slippery slope of extremism. So I think in that sense, we as society need to reclaim Islam and not allow, of course, the government to keep telling us what can or cannot be done, what can or cannot be believed, and to tell us which version of Islam is actually kosher. It's the irony. So that's my short speech for today. I'd like to thank you all again for attending, and good luck for the rest of the day. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.